You've heard the legend. You've seen the movie. But the truth is far more disturbing. William Wallace wasn't just a freedom fighter. He was a man dragged into a nightmare, crushed between empires, and remembered not because he lived, but because of how he died. His final moments weren't just cruel, they were orchestrated, designed as a living warning to anyone who dared defy the English crown. But long before he was tortured in public and butchered alive, Wallace was a shadow, born in a land tearing itself apart, rising from obscurity to command armies, and hunted like an animal. His rebellion would change the fate of a nation, and his end would define a generation's fear. This is not the sanitized story. This isn't Braveheart. This is the real story of what happened to William Wallace, one of the most horrific ends any human being has ever suffered. Scotland was already dying when William Wallace was born. Not in the way history books might suggest, not with grand battles or sieges, not with thunderous clashes of armies, but with silence. With a single man's fall from his horse on a cold March night in 1286, that man was King Alexander III, and when his body was found broken on the rocks below the cliffs of Kinghorn, the heart of Scotland cracked with him. He was the last strong king, and when he died he took Scotland's stability with him. There was no son to inherit the crown. No adult heir with experience or loyalty. The only direct descendant left was a little girl, the 3-year-old Margaret of Norway, Alexander's granddaughter. She lived across the sea and had never even set foot on Scottish soil. But for 2 precious years, she was Scotland's only hope of continuity, a fragile hope packed into a child's body. And then in 1290, she died too. Sick on the voyage to Scotland, dead before she could be crowned, no ceremony, no coronation, no clear future. What followed was chaos in noble clothing. With the royal line extinguished, more than a dozen powerful Scottish nobles rose up, each claiming they had the blood and the right to be king. 13 men, all clawing at the empty throne like wolves around a carcass. These were the so-called great competitors, and none of them were prepared to let another claim the crown without a fight. Scotland stood on the brink of civil war, and into this void stepped a man whose name would become synonymous with brutal ambition, Edward I of England. He was no friend to Scotland, but he was clever. He offered help, claiming neutrality. He suggested that he, a respected monarch, would fairly arbitrate between the competitors. He promised to be a judge, but not without a price. He demanded that every Scottish noble recognize him as their feudal overlord. A quiet sentence, but it would become a scream later. Many of the competitors agreed, some out of fear, others out of hope for Edward's favor. After all, who would dare defy the King of England? In 1292, Edward handed the crown to John Balliol, a man with distant royal blood and an even more distant spine. Balliol became king, but Edward never let him forget who truly ruled. Edward treated him like a vassal, not a sovereign. He summoned Balliol to English courts, forced him to pay homage, and overruled his decisions. He humiliated the man publicly. In one particularly degrading moment, Edward summoned Balliol to answer a lawsuit brought against him by an English merchant, as if he were nothing more than a local baron. It was clear to everyone, Scotland didn't have a king, it had a puppet. The Scottish nobles were outraged but powerless. England's shadow grew longer over their land, and Balliol, nicknamed Tomb Tabard or Empty Coat, became the symbol of a crown with no dignity left. Then came the tipping point. In 1295, fed up with Edward's control, Scottish nobles formed the Auld Alliance with France, England's ancient enemy. They hoped that by joining forces they could finally free themselves from Edward's grip, but they had badly underestimated the man they were defying. Edward responded not with diplomacy, but with fire and steel. In 1296 he launched a full-scale invasion of Scotland. His army swept through the borders, razed towns, burned abbeys, and executed nobles. The city of Berwick was the first to fall, and what happened there would never be forgotten. Berwick-upon-Tweed, a bustling port town full of merchants, farmers, and families, was turned into a massacre site. Edward's army butchered thousands, men, women, even children. No one was spared, blood filled the streets. Houses were set aflame with people still inside. It was not war, it was slaughter, a deliberate message carved in bodies. Scotland had dared to defy Edward, and now it would pay. Balliol, utterly defeated and humiliated, was forced to abdicate. Edward stripped the royal insignia from him with his own hands. The empty coat was sent to the Tower of London. Scotland was left leaderless again. But this time there would be no more crowns. Edward didn't want a puppet anymore. He wanted total control. He even stole the Stone of Destiny. This ancient block of sandstone, used for centuries in the coronation of Scottish kings, was ripped from Scone Abbey and transported to Westminster Abbey in London. Edward ordered it placed beneath the English throne, so that every English monarch from that day on would sit atop a symbol of Scottish defeat. It was psychological warfare. He didn't just want to conquer the land, he wanted to erase its identity. And for a time it seemed he might succeed. Scotland was splintered, its nobles were terrified, scattered or bought. The English garrisons tightened their grip on every castle, every city, every corner. But not everyone was ready to bow. In the mist and forests, in the hills and hidden glens, murmurs of rebellion began to stir. Whispers passed from village to village about a man who refused to kneel, a man who would not play politics or kiss rings, a man who fought not as a noble but as a warrior of the land. William Wallace. No one's quite sure where he came from. Some say he was the son of a minor knight, others believe he was a commoner, a rogue, a bandit. His name doesn't appear in royal records. There are no formal titles, no grand holdings, no long family trees behind him, just the echo of a man who picked up a sword and said no. What is known is this: sometime around 1297, Wallace emerged from obscurity with blood on his hands and an army behind him. His first major act was the killing of the English Sheriff of Lanark, a man named William Heselrigg. Some say Wallace did it because the sheriff executed his wife. Others say it was simply revenge against the English occupation. Either way, Wallace struck without mercy, and from that moment on, he was no longer a rumor. He was a threat. Edward had tried to crush Scotland into silence, but Wallace would speak loudly, not with words but with fire, steel, and fury. And as Scotland bled, it began to hope again. Not in crowns, not in nobles, but in a man with nothing to lose and everything to fight for. The broken kingdom was about to rise. He didn't look like a savior. He wasn't born in a castle or raised on the battlefield. No courtly upbringing, no royal blood, just a name, William Wallace, and a fire inside him that would burn brighter than any crown. In the vacuum left by Edward's conquest and John Balliol's disgrace, Scotland needed heroes. What it got instead was Wallace, fierce, relentless, and totally unpredictable. His early life remains cloaked in mystery. The official records say almost nothing. Historians argue over whether he was a nobleman's son or a mere outlaw. Some traditions place his birthplace in Elderslie, Renfrewshire. Others say Ellerslie, near Ayrshire. What we do know is that he was well educated, fluent in Latin, able to read and write, trained in swordsmanship. That wasn't common for a peasant. So while he may not have been royalty, Wallace wasn't ordinary either. He straddled both worlds, educated but rugged, cultured but furious. And something or someone set him off. According to later sources, Wallace's rebellion was sparked by a single, deeply personal act of violence. The English Sheriff of Lanark, William Heselrigg, had Wallace's wife executed. Some say she had helped him escape an English patrol. Others suggest she was taken hostage and murdered as a warning. Either way, the woman he loved was dead, and Wallace's response was immediate, brutal, and unforgettable. He led a night raid on Lanark in 1297, stormed the town, hunted down the sheriff, and killed him. Not just with a sword, Wallace allegedly hacked Heselrigg to pieces, limb by limb. The message was unmistakable. Wallace wasn't interested in diplomacy, he wanted blood. And he wouldn't wait for permission. This wasn't a formal uprising. It wasn't approved by nobles or planned by councils. It was guerrilla warfare, fast, savage, and completely outside the rulebook. Wallace began launching lightning raids on English outposts. He targeted supply lines, ambushed soldiers, and set fire to garrisons. His men struck quickly, melted into the forests, and disappeared before English reinforcements could arrive. He had no army, at least not at first. What he had were volunteers, farmers, blacksmiths, woodsmen, men who had lost their land, their families, or their pride to the English occupation. They didn't wear uniforms, they didn't march in lines, but they followed Wallace because he offered something no noble had given them, the chance to strike back. And for the first time in years, England began to bleed. The English governor of Scotland, the Earl of Surrey, took notice. He dismissed Wallace at first, called him a mere outlaw, a brigand, not worth serious attention. But as more and more English soldiers vanished in the woods and as more forts were burned to the ground, the tone changed. Wallace was becoming more than a thorn. He was becoming a symbol, a ghost in the trees, the man who refused to kneel. And he wasn't alone. Around the same time, another rebellion was rising in northeastern Scotland, led by a nobleman named Andrew Moray. Moray and Wallace had never met, but their causes were identical. Two fires burning from opposite ends of the country, drawing strength from the same rage. Eventually, the two resistance leaders joined forces. For the first time since Balliol's fall, Scotland had something resembling a national resistance. And then, in September 1297, Wallace faced his first true test, the Battle of Stirling Bridge. The English army was massive, perhaps 9,000 strong, heavy cavalry, trained archers, seasoned warriors. Wallace and Moray had at most 5,000 ragtag fighters, many of them wielding farming tools or salvaged weapons. By all logic, the battle should have been a massacre. But Wallace understood something the English didn't. The river Forth at Stirling was narrow. Only a few soldiers could cross the bridge at a time. The English commander, Hugh de Cressingham, insisted on advancing anyway. He wanted to crush the rebellion quickly, so one by one the English soldiers began marching across the wooden bridge, and Wallace waited. When half the English army had crossed, trapped between the river and the swampy ground, Wallace struck. His men surged forward and tore through the English ranks with brutal efficiency. Cavalry couldn't maneuver, archers couldn't get into position. The English were trapped and slaughtered. The bridge was destroyed, and the rest of the army, watching helplessly from the other side of the river, fled. It was an overwhelming Scottish victory, and a humiliation for the English crown. Even more importantly, Wallace had done it without traditional armies, without foreign allies, and without noble approval. He had won with rebels and farmers, with intelligence and audacity. The legend was no longer just whispered, it was shouted. In the aftermath of the battle, Wallace was knighted by the Scottish nobility, possibly by Robert the Bruce himself, and made Guardian of Scotland. From outlaw to national leader, Wallace had achieved what no one thought possible. But power comes with problems, and Wallace was never meant for politics. As Guardian, he struggled to unite the nobility. Many still viewed him as a threat, too rough, too independent, too low-born. They resented his authority and questioned his legitimacy. Meanwhile, Edward I, furious over his army's defeat, prepared for revenge. Wallace responded with boldness. He invaded northern England in early 1298, ravaging Northumberland and Cumbria, burning villages and terrifying the English countryside. The raids served two purposes, punishment and strategy. By drawing Edward's attention southward, Wallace hoped to keep Scotland free of occupation. But Edward wasn't playing defense. By mid-1298, Edward marched north with a colossal army, perhaps 15,000 strong, including thousands of cavalry and longbowmen. Wallace had never faced a force of this scale, and his allies began to vanish. Many Scottish nobles refused to fight, some abandoned Wallace entirely. Still, he stood his ground at Falkirk. The Battle of Falkirk was nothing like Stirling. Wallace tried to use defensive tactics, forming schiltrons, tight circles of spearmen, to repel the cavalry, but the English longbowmen tore through them. The cavalry broke their ranks. Wallace's army was annihilated. Thousands of Scots died. It was Wallace's first great failure. He escaped with his life, but his title and much of his support was gone. He resigned as Guardian of Scotland. His rebellion had sparked a fire, but it was no longer his to command. Still, Edward couldn't kill the idea of Wallace. Despite the defeat at Falkirk, Wallace's legend only grew. His story spread like wildfire. Through songs, through tales whispered around hearts, through sermons in churches, he became a symbol of freedom, of resistance, of courage in the face of tyranny. But Wallace himself, he disappeared. For years he became a ghost again. Living in exile, traveling in secret, possibly even seeking aid in France. No one knows exactly where he went or what he did, but one thing was certain: Edward never stopped hunting him. And one day, that hunt would succeed. After the crushing defeat at Falkirk, William Wallace vanished from the battlefield. But the flames of rebellion he ignited were far from extinguished. Scotland was a tinderbox, and every act of English oppression added fuel. The country was fractured, desperate, and hungry for freedom. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, was ruthless and cunning. His brutal invasion had shattered Scottish resistance. But the man himself was no ordinary king. He was a warrior with an iron will and a calculating mind, and he had no intention of allowing Scotland to slip from his grasp again. Edward tightened his grip. He installed English officials to rule the land. He demanded taxes. He quartered soldiers in Scottish homes. Any hint of rebellion was met with swift, merciless punishment, executions, confiscations, and public displays of cruelty designed to crush hope. But Scotland was not a land to be broken so easily. Even as Edward fortified his hold, the Scots rallied. In towns and villages, stories of Wallace's courage spread like wildfire. Bards sang his songs, children whispered his name, and nobles, despite their differences, began to see that resistance was possible, even necessary. And then a spark struck. It came from an unlikely place, Robert the Bruce. Robert Bruce was a man torn between two worlds. A powerful noble with claims to the Scottish throne, he was both a warrior and a politician. He had sworn loyalty to Edward I, but he was also a Scotsman, and the weight of his nation's suffering bore heavily on his conscience. In 1306, after years of skirting between allegiance and rebellion, Bruce made his move. In a sudden and bold act, he killed his rival John Comyn, a fellow Scottish noble who supported the English. This act of betrayal shocked Scotland, but it also signaled the start of a new chapter in the fight for freedom. Bruce was crowned King of Scots at Scone Abbey, the same place where the Stone of Destiny had once symbolized Scottish sovereignty. For the first time in years, Scotland had a native king determined to reclaim his country. But Edward I would not let the crown slip away so easily. Furious and humiliated, he prepared to crush Bruce's uprising with the full force of England. The conflict between Bruce and Edward reignited the flames of war across Scotland. Battles erupted in every corner, from the Highlands to the Lowlands. Loyalties shifted like sand, and old alliances shattered as nobles chose sides. For the Scots, the fight was more than political, it was personal. The brutal English occupation had left scars too deep to heal quietly. Villages were burned, families torn apart, and centuries-old traditions threatened with extinction. Every act of defiance carried the weight of centuries of pride and pain. Meanwhile, William Wallace remained a shadow in this new war. Though no longer guardian of Scotland, his legacy haunted every battle. His name inspired soldiers who had never met him. His spirit fueled the resistance that refused to die. The English never stopped hunting him, and eventually their persistence paid off. In 1305, Wallace was betrayed, captured near Glasgow, and dragged to London. What happened next was beyond anything even Edward could have imagined. Wallace was put on trial, not for rebellion, but for treason. To the English crown, his crime was unforgivable. Refusing to swear loyalty to Edward I, the trial was a spectacle designed to humiliate and break him. Wallace defended himself fiercely, speaking with a strength that stunned the court, but there was no mercy. He was sentenced to one of the most horrific executions in history. He would be hanged, drawn, and quartered. On the day of his execution, Wallace's body was subjected to agony beyond belief. He was dragged through the streets of London, publicly humiliated and tortured. Then he was hanged, not until death, but until near death, before being disemboweled, emasculated, and finally cut into 4 parts. His head was severed and placed on a spike atop London Bridge, a warning to any who dared challenge English rule. But even in death, William Wallace's legacy refused to fade. His sacrifice became the rallying cry for Scottish independence, inspiring Robert the Bruce and countless others to continue the fight. Scotland would remain under English rule for decades, but the spirit of Wallace, fierce, unyielding, and free, would never be broken. His story is not just about war or politics. It's about the cost of freedom, the price of resistance, and the enduring power of hope against impossible odds. This was the spark that ignited centuries of struggle, a fire that still burns in the heart of Scotland today. William Wallace's death was supposed to end the rebellion. The English crown expected his execution to crush Scottish hopes and seal Edward I's conquest forever, but history had other plans. Instead of dying with Wallace, the spirit of Scottish resistance was reborn stronger, fiercer, and more relentless than ever before. Wallace became a martyr, not just a man who fought, but a symbol of freedom itself. His gruesome death sparked outrage, inspired defiance, and set Scotland on a course that would change the course of history. In the immediate aftermath, Scotland was fractured. The nobility was divided. Many Scottish lords were cautious, unwilling to openly defy Edward's overwhelming power. But among the common people and many younger nobles, Wallace's sacrifice was a call to arms. One man in particular answered that call, Robert the Bruce. Bruce was a complex figure. His loyalties had often wavered, and he had made compromises with Edward's government to protect his lands. Yet, Wallace's execution stirred something deep within him. He saw that Scotland's future couldn't be bought with favors or half measures. In 1306, Robert the Bruce took a dramatic step. He crowned himself King of Scots at Scone, claiming the throne in defiance of English rule. This bold act was both a declaration and a challenge. No longer would Scotland submit quietly to Edward's domination. But Bruce's rise was violent and chaotic. His murder of rival John Comyn alienated many nobles, forcing Bruce into open warfare against both English forces and Scottish factions loyal to England. It was a dangerous gamble, and Bruce's early reign was marked by brutal battles, betrayals, and narrow escapes. Meanwhile, the common Scots rallied behind Bruce's banner. The memory of Wallace's sacrifice fueled their courage. His name was invoked in battle cries, songs, and stories told around hearthfires. He was no longer just a man but a legend, an icon of resistance who transcended his mortal fate. Edward I, aging but still formidable, launched a final campaign to crush Bruce and the rebellion once and for all. But fate had other plans. In 1307, Edward died, his iron grip loosening with his last breath. His son, Edward II, inherited a kingdom weary from war and less capable of sustaining the brutal campaign in Scotland. This shift in power gave Bruce the opening he needed. Over the next several years, he mounted a relentless campaign of guerrilla warfare, winning victory after victory. Scottish forces recaptured towns, castles, and strategic strongholds. By 1314, Bruce was ready to strike a decisive blow. He gathered his army and marched to Stirling Castle, the gateway to the north, and a symbol of English power in Scotland. The Battle of Bannockburn was unlike anything Scotland had seen since Wallace's time. Edward II led a massive English army, confident that he would crush the rebellion once and for all. But Bruce's forces, fueled by years of hardship and inspired by the memory of Wallace, fought with a ferocity that shocked the English. The Scottish schiltrons, formations of spearmen, held firm against cavalry charges. Bruce himself fought at the front lines, embodying the warrior king that Scotland needed. After 2 days of brutal fighting, the English army was routed. Bannockburn was a stunning Scottish victory, one that secured Bruce's reign and dealt a crushing blow to English ambitions in Scotland. The victory at Bannockburn marked a turning point. For the first time in centuries, Scotland stood as an independent kingdom. The memory of Wallace had helped shape this new era of freedom and pride. But Wallace's legacy wasn't just political, it was cultural. His story was carried forward in poems, ballads, and later, in the writings of historians and storytellers. The most famous of these was the epic poem, The Wallace by Blind Harry, written about a century after Wallace's death. Though historically inaccurate in many details, the poem captured the imagination of generations and helped cement Wallace as a heroic figure in Scottish folklore. Beyond stories, Wallace's image became a symbol of Scottish identity. Statues, monuments, and memorials were erected. His name was invoked during later struggles for independence and during moments of national pride. In the centuries that followed, Wallace inspired countless artists, writers, and politicians. But the truth of Wallace, the man beneath the myth, was more complicated. He was a fierce warrior, yes, but also a man shaped by his times. A man who made ruthless choices, who lived outside the law, and who challenged not just English power but the established order itself. His rebellion was as much about justice and survival as it was about nationalism. He represented the common Scots' anger against oppression, their desperate hope for freedom, and their willingness to fight against overwhelming odds. Even today, Wallace's legacy remains alive and powerful. Tourists visit the Wallace Monument near Stirling, standing tall over the Scottish landscape. They learn about his battles, his capture, and his execution. They hear the stories of his courage and sacrifice. His life has been immortalized in films, most famously in Braveheart. Though Hollywood took liberties with the story, the film helped introduce William Wallace to a global audience and sparked renewed interest in Scotland's turbulent history. But beyond the movies and monuments, Wallace's true legacy lies in the spirit he inspired, the idea that freedom is worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Scotland's fight for independence didn't end with Wallace, or even with Robert the Bruce. It continued through centuries of conflict, political upheaval, and cultural survival. Yet whenever Scots remember their history, they remember William Wallace, not just as a man, but as the embodiment of a nation's unyielding quest for liberty. His story reminds us that history is not just about kings and battles, but about people, their courage, their pain, and their dreams. And in that, Wallace's legacy is eternal. The story of William Wallace and Robert the Bruce is often told as a saga of warriors clashing on the battlefield, swords and shields against royal armies. But beneath the blood and the battles, the fight for Scotland was also a profound struggle for the very soul of the nation. It was a battle over identity, faith, loyalty, and the future, a war waged not just with weapons, but with hearts and minds. After the seismic victory at Bannockburn in 1314, Scotland tasted freedom. But the road ahead was treacherous, filled with political intrigue, fragile alliances, and relentless threats. The English crown refused to accept defeat. Edward II's successor, Edward III, would later reign with a renewed ambition to reclaim Scotland, and the shadow of conflict loomed large for decades. Within Scotland itself, divisions persisted. The country was not a united front. Clans and nobles competed for power, each with their own interests and loyalties. The question of Scotland's future was as much about internal unity as it was about independence from England. At the heart of this turmoil was the legacy of William Wallace. Wallace was not a nobleman, but a commoner who rose to lead. His defiance against English rule was rooted in a fierce sense of justice and protection of his homeland. For many Scots, Wallace was a symbol of the power of ordinary people to challenge tyranny. But this also meant that after his death, the ruling classes were wary of the revolutionary implications of his rebellion. Wallace's brand of resistance challenged the established hierarchy. His uprising was, in many ways, a populist revolt. Robert the Bruce, in contrast, was a king born into nobility. His claim to the throne rested on bloodlines and political alliances. His reign sought to stabilize Scotland through monarchy, uniting nobles and clans under one crown. This tension between the ideals Wallace embodied and the realities of Bruce's rule reflected a broader struggle within Scotland, between radical freedom and the order needed to govern a nation. The centuries that followed saw this struggle unfold repeatedly. In the aftermath of Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce worked tirelessly to consolidate his reign. He secured recognition from the Pope and forged alliances across Europe. His leadership laid the foundations of the modern Scottish state. Yet even as Bruce built castles and negotiated treaties, the spirit of Wallace lived on in the hearts of many Scots who yearned for a freedom that transcended royal decree. The fight for Scotland's soul was also a fight over religion. During Wallace's time, Scotland was a deeply Christian land, but its church was struggling for independence from English religious authority. The Scottish Church sought to assert its autonomy, paralleling the political struggle for Scottish sovereignty. William Wallace's rebellion was entwined with this quest for spiritual as well as political freedom. The English crown sought to impose its religious influence alongside political control, threatening the distinct Scottish identity. Robert the Bruce's reign saw further conflict over church authority. The Pope's recognition of Bruce's kingship was not just a political endorsement, but a spiritual victory for Scotland's church independence. These religious struggles were often overshadowed by the battles on the field, but they were critical in shaping the nation's character and sense of self. Beyond politics and faith, the fight for Scotland's soul was cultural. Scottish language, traditions, and laws faced constant pressure from English influence. For many Scots, holding on to their culture was an act of resistance in itself. The legacy of Wallace and Bruce inspired poetry, song, and art that celebrated the distinctiveness of Scotland. Bards carried their stories across generations, reminding people of their shared past and shared struggle. The centuries of conflict forged a resilient spirit, a fierce pride in Scotland's uniqueness and freedom. Yet, the fight for independence was never straightforward. The wars of Scottish independence dragged on through the 14th and 15th centuries, with intermittent periods of peace and renewed conflict. The English crown continued to assert claims, while Scotland navigated alliances with France and other powers. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328 officially recognized Scotland's independence, but peace was fragile. Borders remained contested and internal strife simmered. As time passed, the memory of William Wallace was sometimes overshadowed by later heroes like Robert the Bruce or Mary, Queen of Scots, but his legacy as a foundational figure remained. His life reminded Scots that freedom demanded sacrifice, and that tyranny must always be challenged. In modern times, Wallace's story has become a beacon of national pride. Statues, literature, and films keep his memory alive, celebrating the courage of a man who dared to stand against one of the most powerful kings in Europe. Yet, understanding Wallace means looking beyond the legend to the complex realities of his time. The harshness of medieval warfare, the brutal politics, and the human cost of rebellion. His story is not just heroic, it is tragic, It speaks to the high price of freedom and the resilience of those who fight for it. As Scotland continues to debate its place in the world today, the echoes of Wallace's fight still resonate. His life and death remind us that history is never just about the past, it shapes who we are and who we aspire to be. The battle for Scotland's soul, begun centuries ago, is ongoing, and William Wallace remains at its heart, a symbol of courage, resistance, and hope. William Wallace's story is one of courage, tragedy, and an unbreakable spirit that has echoed through the centuries. But what is it about Wallace that continues to captivate people, not just in Scotland but around the world? Why does his legacy remain so powerful more than 700 years after his brutal execution? To understand this, we need to look beyond the battles and political upheaval. Wallace's true significance lies in the values he represented: freedom, resistance against oppression, and the courage to stand up when all odds are against you. In the brutal world of medieval Scotland, where violence was constant and survival was uncertain, Wallace rose as an unlikely hero. He was not born into wealth or royal blood. He was a man of the people, a symbol that ordinary individuals could challenge empires and change history. His fight was not just about national pride, it was about defending the dignity and rights of his fellow Scots. The English occupation was marked by cruelty, harsh taxes, forced conscriptions, and brutal reprisals against any form of dissent. For Wallace and many others, the rebellion was a moral cause, a stand against injustice. The harshness of his execution, hanged, drawn, and quartered, was meant to serve as a terrifying warning to anyone who might follow in his footsteps. Yet, instead of erasing his influence, it immortalized him. The public spectacle of his death turned Wallace into a martyr, a figure whose sacrifice symbolized the struggle for freedom itself. This transformation from man to legend was helped by stories and songs passed down through generations. Oral tradition kept his memory alive, shaping it into a powerful narrative of heroism and sacrifice. One of the most important ways Wallace's story was preserved was through the epic poem, The Wallace, written by the Scottish minstrel blind Harry in the late 1400s. Though the poem includes many embellishments and historical inaccuracies, it played a crucial role in turning Wallace into a larger-than-life figure, inspiring patriotism and resistance during later periods of conflict. Wallace's legacy also took on symbolic importance during the rise of Scottish nationalism centuries later. When Scotland faced political pressures and challenges to its sovereignty, leaders and activists invoked Wallace's image to rally support and inspire unity. His story became a touchstone for ideas about liberty, justice, and the right to self-determination. In this way, Wallace transcended his historical moment to become an enduring emblem of the universal human struggle for freedom. The influence of William Wallace extends beyond Scotland's borders as well. His tale of defiance against a powerful empire resonates with oppressed people worldwide, making him a symbol of resistance to tyranny wherever it is found. In modern popular culture, Wallace's story has reached a global audience, most notably through the 1995 film Braveheart. While the movie took liberties with history, it captured the emotional essence of Wallace's fight, a man who refused to accept subjugation and inspired a nation to rise. Braveheart introduced millions to the legend, sparking renewed interest in Scotland's history and the long fight for independence. It also brought attention to the complex realities behind the myth, encouraging audiences to explore the true story behind the legend. Today, Wallace is commemorated in numerous ways across Scotland. The imposing Wallace Monument near Stirling stands as a tribute to his life and sacrifice, overlooking the landscape where much of his struggle took place. Schools, streets, and public places bear his name, reminding Scots of their shared heritage. Annual events and reenactments keep his story vibrant, connecting people with their past. But Wallace's legacy is not just about monuments or stories. It lives on in the Scottish spirit, the determination to stand up for what is right, the courage to face overwhelming odds, and the refusal to be silenced. Scotland's continued debates over independence and identity often echo the themes of Wallace's time. The questions of who controls the land, how people govern themselves, and what freedoms are worth fighting for remain as relevant now as they were in the 13th century. In many ways, Wallace's life and legacy remind us that history is not just about kings and battles. It is about the power of individuals and communities to shape their destiny. His story teaches us that even in the darkest moments, hope can survive, that courage can inspire generations, and that the fight for freedom is never truly over. William Wallace's journey, from a farmer's son to a national hero, from a rebel to a martyr, is a testament to the enduring power of human will. It reminds us that the struggle for justice and liberty is a timeless one, crossing centuries and cultures. As we reflect on his life, we also confront the costs of rebellion, the pain, sacrifice, and loss that come with standing against overwhelming power. But above all, we celebrate the triumph of the human spirit, a spirit that refuses to bow, that dares to dream of a better future, and that inspires others to take up the fight. The story of William Wallace is a story for all time, a beacon of hope, a symbol of resilience, and a call to remember that freedom is the most precious gift of all. The story of William Wallace is often told as a tale of glory, of heroic battles and fierce resistance against tyranny, but beneath the surface of every great rebellion lies a darker reality, shaped by betrayal, heartbreak, and the terrible cost of freedom. Wallace's life was no exception. His rise to power was marked not only by courage and leadership, but also by the complex and brutal world of medieval politics, where allies were few and enemies lurked even closer than the English forces he fought against. Even before his final battle and capture, Wallace faced the treachery of those he once trusted. The Scottish nobility was deeply divided. Many were cautious, others opportunistic, and some actively collaborated with the English crown to protect their own wealth and power. In this fractured landscape, loyalty was a fragile thing. Wallace's status as a commoner made it difficult for him to win the full support of the aristocracy, who viewed him with suspicion or disdain. Many nobles saw him as a threat to their influence, a dangerous upstart who challenged not just English rule but the social order itself. This division weakened the Scottish cause at critical moments. While Wallace inspired the common people, he struggled to unite the nobles behind a single vision of independence. His guerrilla tactics and sudden raids were effective but alienated some lords who preferred negotiation or cautious resistance. Perhaps the greatest betrayal came in 1305, when Wallace was captured not by the English alone, but through a web of deception involving Scottish informants. Historical records suggest that a Scottish knight, possibly John de Menteith, played a key role in his arrest. Whether motivated by self-preservation, fear, or personal gain, this betrayal marked a tragic turning point. Wallace was handed over to the English and subjected to a trial that was little more than a formality. The charges were severe: treason, rebellion, and murder. The trial's outcome was predetermined, a grim spectacle designed to crush Scottish morale. The sentence was as brutal as it was symbolic. Wallace was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most horrific punishment reserved for traitors. The execution was meant to be a terrifying message, a warning that defiance would meet with unimaginable cruelty. But instead, it elevated Wallace to martyrdom. The public nature of the execution, the cruelty inflicted upon him, and the fact that he refused to ask for mercy or name his allies turned Wallace into a legend. His courage in the face of death inspired awe and defiance rather than submission. But the betrayal didn't end with Wallace's death. The struggle for Scotland's freedom continued to be haunted by internal divisions and shifting loyalties. Robert the Bruce, who would become Scotland's greatest hero after Wallace, was himself a figure of complicated allegiance. Before his coronation as king, Bruce had at times allied with the English and at times with Scottish rebels. His murder of John Comyn, a rival claimant to the throne in a church, was a shocking act that divided Scotland further. It alienated many nobles and forced Bruce to fight not only the English but Scottish factions opposed to him. This violent consolidation of power shows how the fight for freedom was intertwined with personal ambition and ruthless politics. The Long War took a terrible toll on the people of Scotland. Villages were burned, farmland devastated, and countless lives lost in battles, raids, and reprisals. The suffering was not just physical, it was a deep wound to the social fabric. Families were torn apart, alliances shattered, and trust eroded. For ordinary Scots, the question was not just about who would rule, but about survival itself. Despite the hardships, the spirit of resistance endured. The sacrifices of Wallace and those who followed created a legacy that could not be extinguished by betrayal or defeat. Their story is a reminder that freedom demands a heavy price, and that the path to liberty is rarely simple or clean. Wallace's life and death teach us about the complexities of rebellion, the courage it takes, the enemies faced both outside and within, and the human cost of standing against oppression. As Scotland moved forward, the memory of Wallace became a unifying force, a symbol of what could be achieved when people dared to resist. But the shadows of betrayal and conflict also serve as cautionary tales, warning that freedom requires vigilance, unity, and sometimes painful compromise. The story of William Wallace is more than a chapter in history. It is a mirror reflecting the timeless struggle for justice and the human yearning for dignity. His legacy challenges us to remember that heroes are not perfect, that freedom is hard-won, and that the true cost of independence is measured not just in victories, but in sacrifices. Even today, as Scotland debates its future, the lessons from Wallace's life remain relevant. The courage to stand for one's beliefs, the pain of betrayal, and the hope for a better tomorrow are as alive now as they were in the dark days of the 13th century. William Wallace's story is not just a tale of the past, it is a living testament to the enduring spirit of a people determined to be free. Long after the final sword was sheathed, and the smoke of battle cleared, William Wallace's legacy refused to fade into the shadows of history. His life, death, and defiance left a permanent mark, not only on the land he fought for, but also on the hearts and minds of generations to come. The story of Wallace is not just preserved in dusty books or forgotten archives. It lives in the monuments that dot the Scottish landscape, in the voices of poets and storytellers, and in the very identity of a nation that still wrestles with the meaning of freedom and sovereignty. One of the most powerful symbols of Wallace's legacy is the Wallace Monument, a towering granite structure perched on Abbey Crag overlooking Stirling. Completed in the 19th century, this monument is more than stone and mortar. It is a shrine to a man whose spirit embodied the fight for Scotland's independence. Visitors to the monument walk through exhibits that detail Wallace's life and times, holding relics like his sword and personal effects. Standing at the top, overlooking the site of the Battle of Stirling Bridge, one can almost feel the echoes of clashing steel and the roar of thousands fighting for their homeland. But monuments are only part of how Wallace's story has been preserved. The power of his legacy comes alive most vividly through stories, tales told and retold by generations of Scots who saw in Wallace a hero who represented their hopes and struggles. Centuries ago, these stories were carried by traveling bards whose songs and poems spread the legend far beyond the battlefield. The epic poem The Wallace, written by Blind Harry in the late 15th century, was instrumental in shaping the popular image of Wallace as a larger-than-life figure, a fearless leader who stood alone against an empire. Though The Wallace blends fact and fiction, it captures the spirit of resistance and sacrifice that define Wallace's story. Through its verses, Wallace became not only a warrior, but a symbol of the unyielding desire for freedom. These stories fueled the fires of Scottish nationalism in the centuries that followed. When Scotland faced new challenges to its independence, whether through political union with England or cultural assimilation, Wallace's name was invoked as a rallying cry. His legacy provided a sense of continuity and identity, reminding Scots that they were heirs to a proud tradition of defiance and self-determination. Wallace's story also transcended Scotland's borders. His fight against oppression resonated with people around the world who saw in him a symbol of the universal struggle for justice. Artists, writers, and filmmakers have taken inspiration from Wallace's life, bringing his story to new audiences and ensuring that his spirit remains alive in popular culture. The 1995 film Braveheart, though criticized for its historical inaccuracies, had a profound impact on how the world perceives Wallace. It transformed him from a relatively obscure medieval figure into a global icon of courage and freedom. The film's emotional portrayal of Wallace's struggle inspired a renewed interest in Scottish history and fueled contemporary debates about Scotland's political future. Yet, the true legacy of William Wallace is not just about monuments or popular culture, it is about the enduring values his life represents. His story challenges us to consider what freedom truly means, the price it demands, and the courage required to defend it. In a world still grappling with oppression and injustice, Wallace's example reminds us that resistance is often necessary, and that ordinary people can shape the course of history. Today, as Scotland faces questions about its identity, sovereignty, and place in the world, Wallace's legacy serves as a touchstone, a reminder of the struggles that built the nation and the dreams that continue to inspire its people. His life and death teach us that history is not just about the past, but about the values we choose to carry forward. William Wallace remains a symbol of hope, resilience, and the unbreakable human spirit, a legacy carved not just in stone but in the very soul of Scotland. William Wallace's life ended in a brutal execution, but the battle he fought was far from over. The story of Scotland's struggle for freedom stretches beyond his death, weaving through centuries of conflict, hope, and identity that still shape the nation today. After Wallace's capture in 1305 and his gruesome execution in London, Scotland was left leaderless but not broken. His sacrifice had ignited a fire that burned in the hearts of Scots determined to reclaim their land and independence. One of the most significant figures to rise from this turmoil was Robert the Bruce, a nobleman who would become Scotland's king and ultimate liberator. Though his path was marked by political maneuvering and controversy, Bruce embodied the same fierce desire for freedom that Wallace had championed. In 1314, nearly a decade after Wallace's death, Bruce led the Scots to a decisive victory at the Battle of Bannockburn. This battle was more than just a military triumph. It was a defining moment in Scotland's fight for sovereignty, a statement that the English crown could be challenged and defeated. Bannockburn secured Bruce's position as king and gave Scotland hope for lasting independence. But the victory was hard-won and fragile. Political pressures, internal divisions, and ongoing conflict with England meant that the struggle was far from complete. The wars of Scottish independence would continue for decades, with battles, treaties, and shifting alliances shaping the fate of the nation. Yet the memory of William Wallace remained a rallying point, an inspiration for those who fought to keep the dream of a free Scotland alive. Over time, the story of Wallace grew beyond its historical roots. It became a legend, a symbol of national pride and resistance that transcended generations. The centuries that followed saw Scotland's identity evolve through unions, rebellions, and cultural revival. The Act of Union in 1707 united Scotland and England under one parliament, creating the United Kingdom, but sparking new debates about autonomy and national identity. Despite political unions, the spirit of independence never fully faded. Scottish poets, artists, and activists kept the memory of Wallace alive, celebrating his courage and sacrifice as part of a larger narrative about freedom and self-determination. In the modern era, discussions about Scottish independence have resurfaced with renewed vigor. Referendums and political movements have brought questions about sovereignty, culture, and governance to the forefront. William Wallace's legacy continues to inform these debates, reminding Scots of their history and the price paid for liberty. But Wallace's story also invites us to consider broader themes: the complexities of rebellion, the cost of war, and the power of memory. His life shows that freedom is not simply given, it must be fought for and defended, often at great personal sacrifice. It teaches us that heroes are not flawless, they are human beings shaped by their time, with strengths and flaws alike. Wallace's tale encourages us to look critically at history, to understand the motivations and challenges behind monumental events. It also challenges us to recognize the enduring human desire for justice and dignity, a desire that transcends time and place. As we reflect on William Wallace's life, we see more than a story of battles and executions. We see a mirror reflecting the struggles faced by people everywhere who dare to stand against oppression. His legacy reminds us that the fight for freedom is ongoing, that history is alive, and that the future is shaped by the courage and choices of those who come before us. In remembering Wallace, we honor not only a man but the enduring human spirit, a spirit that refuses to be silenced, that demands justice, and that dreams of a world where liberty is more than a word but a reality.